Welcome back to Bendy and Strong. This is episode 11. This is the podcast where we talk about strength training for people with Ehlers-Danlos and hypermobility. Now, we've got the guest host back today. This is Shant. This is my rehab guy. He specializes in Ehlers-Danlos and hypermobility, and he is just my go-to guy for anything managing pain and injuries with EDS. So it's awesome to have him back on board.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And today, the topic that we're going to cover is one, I posted up something on my Instagram recently asking what topics you would like us to cover, and this was by far the most popular. And it's also coinciding with a course that I've got coming out at the moment. So the topic is these principles of training with Ehlers-Danlos that will help us to train autonomously. So I've been training for about more than half my life now. I've been training since I was about 13. And over the years, I've developed these principles. And it's also helped working with really good coaches along the way. One of them being Shant, who's currently coaching me. And learning about these principles, they've helped me to just adapt training on the fly. With EDS, we can train. We do need to make some adjustments. And a little bit of knowledge can go a really long way with that. So I mentioned the course that I'm running before. This course is going to go into a lot more depth on these topics. And today the goal is not to give you all the information you need to know, but more to provide you with a starting block. It's almost like a contents page of a book. This is all of the different topics that will really help you so that you're not, going out and just having to find all these different things to learn about. You don't even know where to start. If you feel like you don't know where to start, this is a good starting block.
Yeah, most certainly. And I think it's very important for people with EDS and hypermobility to have a starting point, because there are so many clients with EDS and hypermobility that I come across. They're very lost. They want to start. A lot of them are actually capable to start, but they just don't know what to do, how to do it. And something just as simple as finding the right professional, what to look for in the right professional, can be a game changer for them. So I think this course is going to be very, very important, giving them an insight into these are the key information. These are your starting points. These are the information that's going to help you to navigate through this whole health and fitness industry to find the right information for you.
Something else that a lot of people are talking about these days, and this is not just exclusive to people with EDS and hypermobility, but the fitness knowledge that we have now is just, it's insane, the amount of information that's out there. And I remember when I first started training, the challenge was actually finding information. There was no information out there. Now everyone is spitting out information, and it can feel really overwhelming in the fitness space just for anyone, let alone for people who are also finding, oh man, this is not working for my body. This is hurting me. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to turn to. So some of the stuff that we say today, we've both been in the fitness industry for a long time. I've trained as a bodybuilder, a powerlifter. Shant's been working with athletes for a really long time. So we understand the way that the pros do it. This knowledge is not what we're about to say here. Some of it might counter what a lot of people say, but it's not in a way that we don't understand the way that they're doing it. We're just adding a little bit more to this is how we adapt it for Ehlers-Danlos.
Correct. So think about if you have a car that has a petrol engine, if you put diesel in that car, it's not going to run. Not to say diesel is bad, it's not the right tool for it. So when it comes to health and fitness, there's so much information, and there's not very rarely going to come across that is bad information. It's just the information is not suited for the right person at the right time. So when it comes to hypermobility and EDS, we need to follow certain protocols. We need to play within the rules of the hypermobility and EDS conditions, meaning the rules have to be slightly different compared to what you find. So you might find a whole bunch of different information. None of them are wrong. They might not be the right one for you. And our goal is to give you the information. These are the starting point, how you filter out all the information that are wrong for you and filter in the information that is right for you.
Yeah, awesome. And we're going to get started in a second. Before we do, I'm just going to give the usual disclaimer. Not medical advice. This is just us discussing our ideas and opinions. And if you do want to start exercising, make sure you consult a doctor or physio or relevant medical professional just to get clearance for that. Now, let's get stuck into it. I've got a list here, so if you see me looking down, that's what I'm looking at. The first one that we've got on the list, and this is not necessarily in any particular order, this is just the way that we've listed them out, is progressive overload, which is this idea of basically, if you want to progress in your training, you need to do a little bit more each time or over time, basically. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. And this is actually something I've discussed on my subscriber videos on TikTok recently. And there's sort of two sides of the coin with the progressive overload. I think sometimes people with Ehlers-Danlos are not being taught to do it. For example, if they're going to see a physiotherapist who just gives them some exercises and no clear idea of how to progress that to get better. So progressive overload is one of the most fundamental principles of exercise training, but it applies to anything really.
Yeah.
Like if I want to learn a new language, if I just learn the same 5 words, I'm not going to get any better. So it's a very logical concept, but it's something that we really need to think about with applying. So on the one side, people with Ehlers-Danlos and hypermobility sometimes aren't being told to progressively overload, but on the other hand, sometimes we're encouraged to progressively overload when we shouldn't, or we're told that it's more important than it is to be adding more weight each week and things like that.
Correct. And progressive overload doesn't necessarily always mean one thing. It can also mean you are doing the same task with a little bit more ease. So when it comes to EDS and hypermobility, we need to make sure that we monitor things on a weekly basis because flare-ups can happen. So that can sometimes regress things when we don't want to. But that also means if I'm doing a task for an X amount and the difficulty is 5 out of 10, and then the next week I can do the same task and the difficulty is 4 out of 10, that is still, we're progressing. So sometimes managing what does progressive overload looks like. So the rules can, again, slightly vary for people with EDS and hypermobility. And we want to make sure that we identify that we are using the right measures within that progressive overload principles.
Yeah, so I think the first principle we want to say with progressive overload is we need to be progressing over time. We can't just stay stagnant. And with Ehlers-Danlos, one of the best tools we have to manage our joint pain and dislocations and all of that comes with it, the joint part of the condition, is strengthening and stabilizing. But as part of that, we need to understand we need to be doing some kind of progressive, some sort of progression over time. But then on the other hand, I guess just knowing, I think it can be really helpful with EDS to know the different types, like the different ways that you can progress. So it's not just adding weight to the bar each week. It's like you said, it's maybe doing the same amount, but doing it easier with better technique. One of the other ones we can do is maybe doing an extra rep on the set rather than adding more weight. What else have we got? We've got making the exercise maybe a slightly more complex version of the exercise.
Correct.
We don't have to progress all the weight on all of the sets. If you do 10 kilos for 3 sets, maybe the next week you do 10, 10, and then 12 kilos. So it doesn't have to be all of the sets. What are some other...
And something that is external, for an example, if you're doing a very specific task, so you can do other tasks in your everyday life better. So if you're doing the exercise and that's translating into you doing your everyday tasks, such as walking, such as getting off the chair, you are able to do those everyday tasks a little bit better. That is also progression. That means that is giving you the green signal to add a little bit more complexity to the task that you're going to do in the gym. Meaning you can add a little bit more layers to it. So that means that's going to give you even more capacity to do more things in your everyday life.
Yeah.
So it's a progressive overload. When it comes to this, what we want to do, we are not training professional athletes. What we want to do is take this information and improve the quality of the lives of the population that we're addressing better.
Yeah, actually, that's triggered something as well, a discussion that we've had quite a few times. And that is, like bringing in the everyday life stuff into it. If you find that you can do 10 reps of an exercise, but you're doing it in the morning, and it's when you feel really fresh and full of energy, and then it gets to later in the day after you've done your everyday stuff, and you're able to do 10 reps of that exercise, or even 8 reps when before you couldn't, that's another form of progressive overload. So I think, like you said, with everyday stuff, taking that into account. And I know this is something that we've talked about before with, let's say, walking. If you want to improve your ability to walk, knowing where your threshold is and working within that threshold, but expanding it over time. So I think one of the key things with progressive overload for people with Ehlers-Danlos is I think that the fitness industry sees it in this very linear way: add weight to the bar, do more reps, do more sets. And you can fall into that trap, and also only applying it to strength exercises.
Yes.
Whereas for people with Ehlers-Danlos, this could mean walking 8 minutes instead of 7. And the other thing is, if you're an athlete who's strength training, okay, well, I progressed one of the exercises, maybe some of the other exercises in my session, I'll just do the same weight as I did last week. The same applies with Ehlers-Danlos. Okay, I walked for an extra 4 minutes today when normally I couldn't do that. Nothing else today needs to progress because I've already made some progression.
Correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep.
Happy with that for progressive overload?
Happy with that.
All right. The next thing we've got on the list is strengthening as a management tool especially for like rehab and prehab stuff, over stretching and relying exclusively on manual therapy. And I think within the strength training context, probably less so these days, but a little bit more of an old-fashioned view. You know, when I first started training, stretching was all the rage, and using that as a warm-up or using that as a real enabling tool for strength training. If you can't get into this position, just hold a stretch and then you can go and do it. Whereas we want to really think of it as more strengthening.
Correct. So the population that we're addressing is people with hypermobility and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. With that comes a lot of flexibility within the joint. Flexibility can be good, but too much flexibility compromises the stability of the joint. So think about, I have this finger and I have 3 joints within this finger, right? It moves somewhat naturally like it should. However, people with hypermobility, it moves a little bit more, right? It bends a little bit further in this direction, right? And it bends a little bit further in this direction, like you can completely crunch it.
Yeah.
Now, with that comes a little bit more instability within those joints. Those joints are held together by connective tissue, cartilages at the end of the bones. So when you have those extra bit of movement, stretching it is only going to make it worse. If you are already mobile, you don't need to add more mobility to it. You already have that, which is a good thing. You do have that mobility. We don't need to address it more. What we need to address is creating strength around that structure to make it a little bit more robust so that we can do the things that we want to do. Hence, strengthening is way more superior. I would say strengthening is probably the opposite to stretching. When it comes to any of my hypermobile patients or EDS patients, the first thing I tell them to do is stop stretching. Because every time they stretch, they feel good for 10, 15 minutes. And after that, they're in excruciating amount of pain. And the advice they get is, maybe you need to do a little bit more stretch more frequently. And it becomes a downward cascade of just the pain symptoms. We don't want that. We want to make sure, let's find out why we are having these pains. The reason we're having the pains is because we have this extra bit of movement within our joints, within the structure. So the stability is a little bit more compromised. We need to create strength and robustness around those joints to give them more stability. So you're a little bit more robust, you're a little bit more resilient to be able to do the task, everyday tasks that you want to do. And hence, I would say strengthening is way more superior when it comes to hypermobility and ADS than stretching.
Yeah, and something I'll add to that, because I know that there will have been some people listening to this who instantly switched off when we started talking about this, because you're thinking, this doesn't apply to me, I'm really stiff. So my stiff muscles, I've got stiff muscles, I need to be able to get into the position to train. Maybe you're doing a squat and your hips feel really stiff and jammed up. So you think, okay, no, I need to do these stretches before my squats. Well, this is the thing with Ehlers-Danlos and hypermobility. And this is probably one of the biggest things, you know, on my social media when I'm talking about this, this is a big resistance that comes up is, no, I'm really stiff. You are stiff in your muscles, but not in your joints. That is something with hypermobility. Hypermobility is not referring to flexibility of the muscle necessarily. It has nothing to do with the muscle. Hypermobility is talking about laxity of the connective tissue.
Correct.
So you can have very stiff muscles. And over time, as you get older, perhaps your joints even stiffen up a bit more and you might feel very stiff. but I would still encourage you to seek strength as the way to add movement back into that joint. And the reason that I'm able to say that so confidently is I've seen that work for people who aren't even hypermobile. I've seen this work for people who are very, very stiff. I still remember once there's this, the reverse bench exercise that you've given me.
Yep.
So you're using a lat pull down. It's like you're doing a bench press, but you're pulling the weight into your chest as if you're kind of doing a row. And I remember seeing someone and they were saying, oh, no, I can't get it all the way to my chest. It's a flexibility issue.
Yeah.
And Andrew Locke, who was showing me the exercise, he said to the person, no, this is actually a strength issue.
Correct.
You're too weak to get it there.
Yep.
The muscles in your back aren't strong enough to pull it there. And this was a person who benched over 200 kilos,
Yep.
who was struggling to row weight that I could do comfortably.
Mm.
They did it, and all of a sudden, their flexibility or their ability to reach range of motion improved.
Yep.
So this stiffness, this is a whole paradigm shift. It's moving away from stretching to reduce stiffness and moving towards strengthening and stabilizing. And I think it can get a bit confusing. I think there's two culprits here for the hypermobile crew using stretching as a go-to method. The first one is just uninformed physios and coaches who just, if the only tool you have in your toolbox is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail.
Correct.
And them only knowing, okay, I'm going to hammer this in.
Yep.
The other thing is this paradoxical stiffness of the muscles where we're taught if you've got stiff muscles, stretch.
Correct.
But we need to create this paradigm shift where actually for anyone, a lot of the time, stabilizing and, strengthening the opposite muscle is going to help with stiffness, but it's even more so with hypermobility because the problem creating that stiffness is usually the underlying instability.
Correct. And just to give a bit of a clinical insight into why certain muscles can become tight within a joint, when you have this increased laxity within the joints, meaning an extra range of movement within the joint, your body's going to try to find one specific muscle trying to create the stability. And sometimes what can happen, this specific group of muscle, they can really, really stiffen up in one direction, trying to create that stability. Unfortunately, what happens is your body's just trying to create a natural splint, but that feels like tightness. But your body's actually looking for strength. It is looking for the answer, which is strength to stabilize the muscle, to stabilize the joint. But the way it's doing it is trying to shorten everything, trying to crunch everything together.
Yeah.
So by strength training, what we want to do, we want to make sure that we want to restore the balance. We want to restore the, lack of a better word, symmetry within the joint. So it's not just one muscle, such as your trap is really, really tight. We want to make sure that the other muscles that are going to keep that shoulder girdle or the ring stable, they are all working together. So the trap is not the only one overworking, trying to compensate for everything else.
Yeah. Yeah. Sweet. So principle 1, we've got progressive overload. Principle 2, we've got strengthen instead of just stretching or relying only on manual therapy. And we should probably just take 30 seconds to mention the manual therapy because it can be helpful sometimes.
Correct.
But not on its own because the underlying problem is lack of strength and stability.
Yes. So I love manual therapy as a gateway. So meaning if something's really, really stiff to a point where we can't even get you to move, okay, go get some manual therapy. Give yourself that little window of opportunity where you can actually start moving. Then you can start doing a strength exercise with that range that you have available. But if you're purely relying on manual therapy, then that is not going to be the answer. You're constantly ripping an old Band-Aid off and then putting a new Band-Aid on. You're not actually fixing the problem.
Yeah. And just to clarify there as well, because we've said that applies with the manual therapy, but not so much with the stretching. What's the difference between, could people go away and apply that? Okay, I'll go do some stretches just to open this opportunity up to then strengthen, or not so much?
Not so much. So when it comes to manual therapy, again, it depends on the professional. Most manual therapists, they'll work with the muscular tissue and the fascia within the muscle, right? So they're going to try to manipulate that. And again, that is going to give you a very small window of opportunity to go move. When it comes to stretching, what you're stretching is actually the elastic tissue within the joint. You already have compromised stability within the joints with the connective tissue. Now, if you stretch it even further, so think about a band that has gone really floppy, and your answer is trying to pull the band even further out, try to get a little bit more movement. That is not the answer.
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's a big difference between stretching and manual therapy.
Yeah, that's really helpful actually, because I think that's the misconception is stretching is really affecting my muscles mostly.
Correct.
But we've got this paradoxical thing with Ehlers-Danlos loss and hypermobility that connective tissue is loose, so the muscles tighten up, so we stretch, but that's actually not doing anything with the muscle.
Not
it's
with
just
the muscle.
further loosening the connective tissue.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So those 2 points we've done. Now let's talk about program structure. And in particular with this one, we were talking about, understanding sets and reps, understanding, like, where do we start with this one? It's quite a big topic.
So I think with the program structure, the way we want to approach it is, I'll start with an example. So there are a lot of clients that come to see me. They have downloaded online programs. And they're great programs. There's nothing wrong with those programs. So people who do not have hypermobility, people who do not have EDS, they can get some good benefit out of those online programs. And those programs can be structured in a way with a lot of volumes. They can be structured in a way with a lot of supersets, meaning one exercise performs straight away right after you have performed another exercise. And they're all stacked up together with lots of volume, meaning you're doing lots of exercise and you're doing a lot of repetition within those exercises. Great for a certain group of people, but not for people with hypermobility and EDS. So one of the first things that I will do, I will reduce the number of the exercises. I will pick some really, really good exercises that the person can tolerate. I will reduce the sets and reps to the point where they can tolerate those numbers of repetitions. And I will create recovery time within the exercises. So say, for example, someone saying, no, you need to do sumo deadlift, and then immediately after that, you need to do hip thrust, and then you have to do some jumping jacks. First of all, I will take away the jumping jacks completely, because a lot of high impact elastic bouncing exercises, not the best option for people with hypermobility and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Now, the next would be, okay, let's pick one exercise first. Let's do sumo exercise, or the sumo deadlift. We're going to do a small number of, let's say, 3 sets of 5 reps of sumo deadlift. In between each set, you will take somewhere between 3 to 5 minutes rest or self-managed rest, meaning you won't do the next set until you feel you're ready. Once you have done sumo deadlift, then the sumo deadlift is done. Then you will go do your hip thrusts. Again, the same thing. We will pick a safe number of sets and reps. You will take an X amount of rest in between if you're not sure how much rest, so we can give you some guidance with that. Or if you feel like you can self-manage it, you can do that as well. So that's one way of looking at the programming structure, right? So we are manipulating the number of exercises. We are selecting the exercises in a specific order.
And making sure the sets and reps reflect the personal needs of the individual.
Correct. We don't want to, again, if you want to go back to the very first point of progressive overload, we don't want you to regress because of the program, which is the most common thing that I see. They start really well for the first couple of weeks, and then they all fall downwards. Then they get to a point where they can't even perform any basic movements because they're in so much pain.
Yeah, and I think I'm actually going to skip ahead to a point that we've got a bit further down the list, which is understanding the purpose of the different things in the program, because I think that's really important there. So, it's really difficult when you are first starting out and you're just given a program by someone, or you download a program online and you don't actually know why they've given you these sets and reps, or you don't know why they've given you this particular exercise.
Correct.
Or they prescribe a rest protocol and you don't quite know why they've given you that much rest between exercises, or why we're supersetting them. So this is one of those ones where I'm someone who knows a lot about exercise and training. And what I can see from up here is a lot of the coaches who are prescribing these very specific protocols don't actually know why they're doing it.
Yeah.
And this is a thing, it's kind of like, it sort of reminds me, I'd have especially women coming into me when I was coaching in a gym, and they would say to me, look, Annie, I feel so intimidated by everyone. I walk into the weights room and everyone knows what they're doing and I don't know. And I'm like, dude, as someone who does actually know what I'm doing, I can tell you most people in the gym have got no idea what they're doing, don't feel intimidated by it. So I think it's this assumption when we're starting out that we know nothing and that everyone else knows what they're doing, but not necessarily. And I would really encourage you, if you're working with a coach, to question, why have we added this in? Why has this been included in the program? And if they can't give you an answer, maybe it's not the best protocol. because there might be times when rest, for example, when someone with Ehlers-Danlos is given short rest, maybe it's to increase our ability to recover, or to, like, let's say it's for a specific task. If I'm joining the army and I need to do a lot of things with minimal rest, then I need to be able to prepare my body for that in training, for example. That's an extreme example. I'm not joining the army, but let's say I was. So there may be times when that's needed, but if I'm not joining the army, if I don't need that specific ability, I'm going to take longer rest. So there are times when things are actually important to do. And occasionally, Shant's doing my programming at the moment. Some exercises he will give high reps on, because he says, I want to increase your stamina for this exercise. It's a very safe exercise. And our goal for this particular set is to increase stamina. Now, if I'd said to him, why did you give me high reps? And he said, because we're trying to build muscle or something like that. It's like, that's actually not a good enough answer, because I know that you can build muscle on lower reps. And I know that it's actually safer for me to do lower reps a lot of the time. So that's not a good enough answer. So I think asking the people what the purpose of the exercise is, but if you're doing the program online, maybe doing some research into what they've prescribed you. Now, this comes down to the rest given, the reps given, the sets given, but also the exercise itself. Because if we can understand, okay, this is a rowing exercise, this one hurts my shoulder, but I know this other rowing exercise, which works the same muscles, doesn't hurt my shoulder, maybe I can substitute those in, because I know that the purpose of this was to work these back muscles with this rowing movement. Whereas sometimes I've just assumed that I can replace an exercise, and then I come to you and I say, can I replace it with this? And you say, no, that's actually not the function of this exercise. We're trying to achieve something different.
Exactly.
So understanding that is super important. And this, once you get that, things like boot camp, things like the Les Mills classes, or the group
F45.
fitness, F45 group fitness classes, all of a sudden we start to see, okay, what's the purpose of it? Is to burn calories. There are easier ways and safer ways for me to burn calories. And also I can just eat less and then that takes the calories, tick for the calories. With Ehlers-Danlos, our purpose is not just to burn calories when we're exercising, it's to strengthen specific things, and we need to understand that. So that helps us to be selective about what we're doing, but it also helps us to adapt the exercises if we can't do something for a particular reason. So always understanding the purpose of each specific thing that we've been prescribed.
Perfect.
Now, the next one is warm-ups. And this one for me personally, I reckon this is one of the biggest game changers, was when I stopped. We've already covered stretching, but when I used to start all my warm-ups with stretching, foam rolling, and that was about it. When I started changing it from that to activation exercises.
Correct.
And we'll go over exactly how to approach those activations in a sec, but another protocol that people commonly do, which is pretty old school, is to jump on an exercise bike or cardio machine to do your warm-up, just to get warm. But I would really encourage you to think about strengthening and stabilizing in your warm-ups as the priority.
Correct. So when it comes to warm-ups, yes, the words mean warm up. And you can interpret it in any way you want. So jumping on an exercise bike, of course, it's going to get your body a little bit warm, but it's not going to prepare you for other type of strength, dominant physical activities. What we want the focus of the warm-up to be is prepare the body for the more challenging exercises to come. So if you're going to do some upper body movement, for example, your shoulders and your chest and your back, you need to make sure that you prepare the muscles. You want to wake them up, not wake them up, you want to get them a little bit more optimized to make sure that they're ready to move in those directions. You're just not going for a cold to hit movement. Same way when it comes to the lower body, you want to make sure that the glutes are warm. You want to make sure your core, the muscles are warm, to make sure that they are ready to move. They are ready to, power on to be able to do the more challenging task, or maybe more load dominant task, or a little bit more endurance dominant tasks that are to come after. So I'm pretty sure you have plenty of examples on your page about a few different activations, and we can probably add that later on. But those are the examples of, these are the warm-ups. We are using an activation protocol, meaning we are activating. It's not that the muscles are not activated. They are in a little bit more dormant state. And we want to make sure that we are kind of like connecting them in a direction and producing forces in those directions to make sure that they can perform the task a bit more safely.
Yeah. Yeah. So instead of thinking of the words warm up, maybe think of it as a preparation period at the start of the session.
Yes.
The only exception I would say is if you're somewhere really, really cold and you actually do need to get physically warm first.
Yep.
Especially with the EDS body, we tend to have our limbs and our fingers and toes not working in the cold weather. So if you are somewhere really cold, yes, jump on an exercise bike, do something really safe for your body to get it warm. But then we want to start preparing the body for that.
Correct.
So we want to start with some of the little catchphrases that I really like is stimulate, don't annihilate. So we're stimulating these muscles, we're getting them ready. Another one is isolate, then integrate.
Yep.
So starting off with some of the more isolation exercises. So if I'm doing an upper body day, I'm going to do a lot of the muscles around my shoulder blades. And again, coming back to our previous point of understanding the purpose of things, what's the purpose of that? The purpose of that is that our shoulder joint, we want to make sure that's really stable. And the shoulder joint is a ball and socket. And the socket portion of the shoulder joint is attached to the shoulder blade. So if our shoulder blade is moving around a lot, that creating instability, that can travel down to the shoulder joint or, that same principle applied to other joints. So we're understanding, okay, I'm going to be using my shoulder joint a lot with pressing overhead or even rowing movements.
Yep.
I want to make sure that this movement of my shoulder blade is really nice and almost, grease that movement pattern, oil that movement pattern.
Moving it how it should.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is where we can see, if we had 20 people with Ehlers-Danlos in a room and they'd all gone to see Shant to have their warm-up protocols, some of them might be slightly different. They would all look kind of similar. Some of them might be slightly different. But basically, if you just want without any other information where to get started with this is probably focusing around the postural muscles of that area that you're going to be working that day. So if we're working anything involving the core or the hips, because a lot of the ab muscles attach onto the hips, we want to be working the muscles of the core during our warm-ups, our glutes, and, our thoracic, up around our thoracic spine. So the muscles between our shoulder blades, depending on which section of the body we're working.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Sweet. So the next point that I've got is about conserving energy. And I think this is super important with Ehlers-Danlos, especially. Still important with hypermobility, but probably even more so with Ehlers-Danlos because there's more moving parts. So we kind of talked about this before. We need to understand the purpose of the different things that we're doing. And if we don't get clear about what the purpose of different things are, we can kind of just fall into the generic recommendations that people in the fitness industry give. And I think for a long time, one of the big things, we saw this on old school shows like Biggest Loser and things like this. It's just to get rid of as much energy as possible, which is not actually an effective way to train at all.
No.
So this is a very mindset shift kind of point. With Ehlers-Danlos, we want to conserve energy. And this is within our session. And it's also from our day-to-day life for our session, but also for our session to our day-to-day life. So if you're training before work and your work is likely to get you sore or whatever, if you're standing up a lot at work, if you're in a particular position, we want to actually conserve energy for that. And then vice versa, if you're training after work and you don't have the energy for it, maybe we can adjust things in your day so that you train at a time when you do have more energy.
Correct.
Things like this. So just understanding the whole spoonie concept with Ehlers-Danlos, we have this many points of energy each day. It's less than most people. Everything we do takes up a point of energy. And if we overdraw, we draw into tomorrow's energy. That's really important. But maybe, Shant, you can talk about, that session that we did recently where I was deadlifting and my ankle was subluxing. And then I went to help. Shant was training next to me and I went to help him unload the weights of his bar and you told me off for it.
Yeah. So again, when it comes to conserving energy, think about you have $100 in your bank account and you want to utilize that, you want to invest that $100 so you can get at least $100, if not more, in return. So that way you can take that $100 again and use it the next day for your next activity, whatever it is. So one example that I gave you before was, instead of doing supersets, meaning one exercise straight after another, separate them, make sure that you have enough rest in between the exercises and also in between the sets. Meaning, if I'm giving you deadlift, say for example, this person needs to be able to pick things up from the floor. You know, she has a child, she needs to pick up laundry basket, she needs to unload the dishwasher. She needs to be able to learn how to pick things up from the floor in that hinge position. So I need her to be very, very good with her deadlift. So to be able to get very good with your deadlift, you need to make sure that you have enough rest so you can focus on the actual working set to make sure that you are performing the exercise with really good technique. You're not fatigued, so you're not at a risk of getting injured, but you're also focused enough to learn and retain the information. So that's a very, very important way to conserve energy to be able to perform the task. Remember, everything has to have a purpose. The purpose of this deadlift, so you can take that exercise, take that strength, take that stamina, and take it into your everyday life and do the things that you want to do pain-free, or at least with less pain. The other thing is, when it comes to in-between exercises, the reason I told you not to help me unload my plates, because you have $100 available in your bank account to be able to do your program.
And you've got 200 or more.
Yeah, I have.
As someone without Ehlers-Danlos, he's got a lot more than $100 available.
Correct. So now you have already expended, let's say, $20 out of your bank account. Now you're trying to come and help me unloading my plates. The gesture was fantastic. However, they are not serving any purpose. You are taking money out of your own bank account. So then when you're going to go to the next exercise, you're a little bit more fatigued, meaning you might have a higher risk of getting injured in that exercise, or you may not be able to finish the whole program. Because by the time you have unloaded all the weight for me, then you have done your next 2 or 3 exercises. By the time you have done that, the 4th and 5th exercise, you can't even do them because you're too tired. And this is why we need to make sure that we're not babysitting it, but we're understanding how much we have available, and we want to make the best use of them.
Yeah, I think the thing that really stood out in that particular session for me that I've taken away to other sessions as well was, my ankle was subluxing. It just kept subluxing as I was setting up for deadlift. And we did an exercise, like an activation exercise around my ankles that immediately fixed it. But you were saying to me, I don't want that to come back. I don't want the subluxations to come back. So I felt very strong that day. So when Shant was saying to me, don't help me unload my plates, at first I was like, haha, that's funny.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not that weak. I'm not that fatigued. I can get through this workout. Maybe my muscles can, and maybe my strength level can, but maybe some of these other things, like whatever it was in my ankle that was causing that subluxation, you actually said to me, you said, you're already having that issue. I don't want to put you over that line. So this is a common thing that people with EDS say is, I don't know where my limits are. Actually, the limits maybe aren't just, I'm absolutely fatigued, so I cannot do another step or do another single rep. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's, I can't do another rep without my joint subluxing, or I can't do another joint without this another rep without this joint clicking.
Yeah.
So it's just understanding, okay, this is the threshold. If my threshold is 100, most people can work at 80 or 90. For people with Ehlers-Danlos, our absolute threshold is 100, and we have very strong willpower a lot of the time because we have to have strong willpower to get through life with this condition. But maybe in the gym we need to work at 60. If our capacity is 100, we need to work at 60 because the little things can go wrong.
Yeah.
So one more thing I'll add on to that is that's why I love lower reps for people with Ehlers-Danlos, because we get to do that, instead of doing 15 reps in a set, we could do maybe 5, take a break, reset, have a think about what we're doing, make sure we're not feeling anything bad in our bodies, get our energy level back up, cool down a little bit, like just chill, come back and do another set. And then we're still getting, we can still do 15 reps, but it's over 3 sets instead of 1.
Correct.
And actually one more thing I'll add in there is a while ago for my activation exercises, I was getting a lot of pain doing one particular activation exercise, the lock clams. And what I realized was I was actually rushing through them a little bit and trying to do them too fast. And when I took, instead of, it's a light, low load exercise, how hard could it be? Why would I need to take a couple of minutes rest between each set?
Yeah.
I was just taking 30 seconds rest, but that was my undoing, was I was taking too short of a rest. And I remember one day I came to the gym and one of my friends was there and I was chatting with them a little bit between each set and the pain went away.
Yeah.
And I realized I actually wasn't giving myself enough rest and recovery time.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So the next point that we've got here is, this is what I call it, do more to do more. And you would have heard me talk about this if you've watched my Instagram or TikTok videos. And I think I've even done entire podcasts on this. It's worth a mention. We won't go into huge amounts of depth on this. But basically, with Ehlers-Danlos, and this is not exclusive to people who have it really bad or whatever, this is something with Ehlers-Danlos, it's a fluctuating condition. So even though a lot of people see me as someone who doesn't have it that bad, there are times when it gets really, really bad for me. So this is not... Basically, if you've got Ehlers-Danlos, don't think you're beyond ever sinking to a point where you might really struggle to do a lot of things that you used to be able to do. That's quite normal with Ehlers-Danlos. And if you get to that point, the good news is if you get to that point, it's not like there's no way out. This is not, you've fallen down a hole and you can't climb out. Ehlers-Danlos is like a sine wave. It's a fluctuating.
It's a bit undulated.
It's an undulating condition. And when we're in those low periods, which can happen to anyone with Ehlers-Danlos, a lot of the time we lose our capacity to do things.
Yeah.
And when we lose our capacity to do things, the temptation is to say, well, I can't do anything. I'm not going to do anything, especially when we used to be able to do so much before. So if you used to be able to do barbell squats with 50 or 100 kilos before, and now you can't even do the bar, the temptation is to say, well, I just can't do squats anymore.
Yeah.
But maybe you can do a body weight squat, and maybe you can do a bar squat to the box to half the height that you used to do.
Correct.
And not only maybe you can do that, but maybe that's the ticket to you getting back to being able to do the barbell squats. So do more to do more. When we feel really limited, our temptation is to think I'm limited forever.
Yep.
But we actually can still do things. We just have to completely throw our ego out the window. These are the things I can do. I can regress this exercise back so that I can progress.
Correct. So the principle is focus on what you can do today. Don't think about, if I can't do this today, that means that's the rest of my life. That is never the case. So an example, when it came to your, the SIJ pain that we addressed recently, we had to reduce the range of motion of your deadlift. We had to elevate the deadlift. And fairly quickly, we got up to about 120 kilos of deadlift. Yes, we started with just very, very light weight, but with the right protocol and by regressing things a little bit to make sure that we gave our body the respite, you were able to progress again. Now, is it never going to happen again? No, we know that another flare-up is going to happen. Something's going to happen down the track and we're going to have to address it. Going back in time, when it came to your squat, we had to remove barbell squat. We had to give you a Smith machine squat and with only half the range, because that's what you could do, but that allowed you to go back into full range and full depth barbell squat again. So sometimes just because you're not able to do an exercise right now, that doesn't mean it's a death sentence. It just means right now, my capacity was here, but it is here right now. So I need to make sure that I stay within that threshold, but that threshold is going to give you the ability to go back into your old threshold again.
Yeah, the analogy I use is that with Ehlers-Danlos, like everyone's trying to build a house, but we've just got to build the bricks first. With Ehlers-Danlos, we have to, we have to go and grow the trees and cut the trees down and make that. And we have to, compact the bricks together to actually build the house. Whereas a lot of people have the materials there ready to go and they can just do it.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'll say is I think this happens to everyone. I think this is not exclusive to Ehlers-Danlos, this principle of when things go down, like, you've worked with a lot of injured clients.
Yep.
And they lose their ability to do things. And then the thing that, allows them to get back, you can't just, I'm recovered from my injury. Now I can go back to doing what I used to do.
Correct.
You have to have this build-up period. The thing that's unique to Ehlers-Danlos is this is just all in a day's work for us. This fluctuation can happen even without an injury.
Yep.
It can happen without us doing anything wrong. It can be according to our menstrual cycle, according to an external stress in our life. It can just happen. And that's the frustrating part for us. And also, if you've, for anyone who's listening to this, who's getting into strength training for the first time or after a long break, if you've taken a long time off, it can feel like you can do absolutely nothing. And I know exactly what this feels like. I went through this recently. I took an extended time off training. I came back. It felt like I could do nothing. And the temptation was to say, strength training just isn't for me anymore. I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
Or I'm never going to be able to do what I used to do. This is always going to suck. I'm always going to have to do these silly little isolation exercises. But actually, they're your key to unlock the door to do the things you used to be able to do or you want to do.
Correct. And I'll use myself as an example. So I got really, really sick last week. The week before that, I did 210 kilo deadlift. But this week I had to drop it down to 120 kilo deadlift. And I can do 120 kilo deadlift for reps. But all I can do right now is 2 reps. And that's how I was started. But my body now knows that this is what I can do. I can still move. So I know next week when I'm a little bit better, I've healed a little bit more, I can go back to 140. And very soon, over time, I can go back to 210. But right now, just because I can't do 210 anymore, doesn't mean I'm not going to do absolutely nothing. But also, it doesn't mean just because I could do 210, I'm going to try to push for 210 again. It just means sometimes we need to regress to be able to progress. Something that you have mentioned a lot of times in your podcast and in your posts. It's actually one of my favorite sayings.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Next one that we've got on the list, and this is not something that we can cover in today's podcast by any means, because it is anatomy, understanding anatomy. Now, I mentioned the strength training course before. This is going to be a big part of that, is learning some basic anatomy. So Shant and I actually both have the same or very similar degrees, exercise science degrees. And as part of that, they do teach you a lot of anatomy. This is the same level as, med students first year, or second year med students, or physiotherapy students. So the anatomy knowledge that we both have is quite in depth. And with anatomy, you also need to keep revisiting it. So even if you've just done it once, revising courses, or for me, it was tutoring anatomy. I helped tutor some massage students with anatomy, or I helped to create anatomy courses for people, but it's the kind of thing you need to keep going over and over. But anatomy knowledge, this is my opinion, see if you agree with this. For most people training, non-Ehlers-Danlos people, everyday people, there's a certain degree of anatomy knowledge that's helpful. After that, it kind of can go into the paralysis by analysis realm where it doesn't actually help you. There's a point of diminishing returns. More anatomy knowledge may not necessarily help you unless you're injured or needing specific, protocols. For people with Ehlers-Danlos, the deeper your anatomy knowledge or the deeper the anatomy knowledge of your coach, the better you are off.
Correct. So with general population, I think when it comes to you're not constrained by a lot of the limitations that you would find with Ehlers-Danlos and hypermobility. A certain amount of anatomy knowledge is very good, but after that, I wouldn't say you need a little bit more supportive knowledge of a lot of other principles to support that a little bit more intermediate level of anatomy knowledge. However, when it comes to people with EDS and hypermobility, one of the very key things that I come across a lot is they get a lot lost with their clinicians and practitioners because they do not understand what they're saying. So they're afraid to ask the question, and the clinicians and the coaches and the trainers, they are giving out wrong information, incorrect advice, even though they understand that it's not right. They just they can't pinpoint what it is. They can't really understand. They can't explain it exactly what the problem is. And this is where having good anatomy knowledge is very, very important.
It gives you a BS radar.
Correct. But also sometimes it's also very easy for you to explain something if you have the anatomy knowledge. So, I have had clients, they're just like they're pointing in a region. They don't know exactly what it is. So I have to constantly tell them, show me where, show me what, show me the movement. Whereas if they had the basic anatomy knowledge, they'd be able to say, okay, at the back of my hip or the right of my hip, in my glute region or my hip flexors or my low back region.
As an example, if you say my shoulder hurts, okay, is it the shoulder here or is it more up here or is it here? Is it in the joint itself? Is it where is it? Is it up your neck? Or hip is even more confusing because there's so many regions. A lot of people think they've got low back pain, but it's actually the sacroiliac joint. So it's actually, you know, the hip structure that's contributing to that pain.
Correct. Yes. And this is where having anatomy knowledge, understanding you're basically understanding the tools that you have to work with, which is your body. If you have a decent working knowledge of anatomy, this is going to, you know, help you so much in one, for selecting the right clinician, two, explaining your problems a little bit better, understanding your problems a little bit better. And when you're training, you are going to be able to understand why you're training something. So when you come across an injury, you have a much better understanding. This is the problem. And when your clinician is giving you an exercise, you'll be able to say, I don't think this is the right exercise because I know this is not the problem. You're going about the wrong way. Or if the exercise is right, you'd be like, yep, I know exactly. I just needed to feel that. I needed to, you know, contract that muscle, or I needed to move in that direction. And I know that that's helping me with my shoulder. I know that's helping me with my SIJ. I know that's helping me with my walking.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would add, it's even sometimes as simple as knowing, okay, I'm doing this exercise. Am I feeling it in the right muscle? Or, you know, you gave the example of an Ehlers-Danlos client you had who was doing a glute exercise and that it was, I feel pain. No, that's actually good. That where is the pain in the glute muscle? Okay, that's actually the pain that we want to feel.
Yeah.
And this is kind of inspired. So when I created this course, part of what I did is I sat down with a whole group of people with Ehlers-Danlos, and I sat down with them individually and said, what kind of things do you need to know about? What information would help you that I'll put into this course? And one of the things that one of the people I sat down with said, and this was like, how did I not think of this earlier, was that exact thing of, when I'm doing this exercise, which muscle am I supposed to feel it in? And this is super important for anyone to know, I think. But the reason why it becomes a little bit more important for people with Ehlers-Danlos and hypermobility is because we tend to have these big muscle compensations and movement compensations. And although it's not always the most accurate thing to say whether I'm feeling this muscle or feeling that muscle to determine whether you're doing something correctly or not, it can be a really strong indicator for us. If I'm feeling an exercise in a muscle and I'm like, that is not supposed to be where I'm feeling it, maybe I need to cue the technique a little bit differently, or maybe that exercise isn't the right one for me at the moment. And one more thing I'll add on to this is, this can feel like one of those things where my knowledge is here and the rest of the industry's knowledge is here. And when will I know when I've arrived at the amount of anatomy knowledge that I need? You never will. It's an ongoing journey. You're still learning about anatomy.
Yep.
I'm still learning about anatomy. So please don't think of this as an me and them situation where I'm here and everyone else's knowledge is up here and I need to graduate from some kind of, you know, course to know this. This is an ongoing journey of learning. And like I said before with anatomy, it's really hard to always remember everything. So it's revisiting, relearning, discussing it, applying it. So if it feels overwhelming, just start learning about the names of the joints and the different movements that the joints do.
Correct.
Then you can fill in some of the muscles that perform those movements. Mm-hmm. And then we can start to think about the muscles that oppose those movements. And then you're starting to layer this information on top of each other.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of stuff for the anatomy component of the course. That's the way that we're going to do it, is learning it like that.
It's a working knowledge of your body.
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, one more thing I will add on to the anatomy knowledge is, one of the questions that I'll get, you know, I'll upload a video of me doing an exercise to Instagram or TikTok, and I'll have someone say, hey, I can't do this because I don't have that machine. How am I supposed to do this at home? Or how am I supposed to do this at my gym? Understanding anatomy allows you to change things.
Yep.
And during lockdown, when I was working out in my kitchen, that's what allowed me to still train, was an understanding of anatomy. This is the muscle. This is the movement that the muscle does. This is how gravity works. How can I position that muscle against gravity to work it? So that can be really helpful for that perspective.
Or if you don't have a lot of heavy dumbbells, you have some bands. Yes, I can use the bands and set up in a very specific direction and perform the same exercise because I understand the function of that muscle.
Yeah, and that's similar to the question that people say, you know, for I've had someone ask before, are kettlebells good for hypermobility and Ehlers-Danlos? They can be. It just depends. That's just a weight. That's just how you use it. You could have a backpack full of rocks. That's what some people did in 2020. They had a backpack full of rocks and that's how they lifted weights. it can be good. It just depends on how you're using it with the specific muscles. Coming back to this idea with Ehlers-Danlos, why are we doing a particular movement? Understanding the anatomy, understanding progressive overload with that muscle. How can I overload this muscle? So getting a clear understanding of the different muscles allows you to adapt it to machines, to cable exercises, to dumbbells, to barbells, to kettlebells, and even to bodyweight exercises. I'm not a huge fan of a lot of bodyweight exercises for EDS because it's hard to adjust the intensity with it.
Yeah.
But it can allow you to be a more autonomous and adaptive strength lifter.
Absolutely.
Now, we've got 2 more points. We're going to just very briefly go over nutrition because neither of us are nutritionists. But something I will say is you need to be eating to support your goals. And I think this is where we want to like push back against diet culture in the fitness industry of always losing weight, always getting leaner. From a personal perspective, I've done bodybuilding competitions, and I'm not going to hate on the sport of bodybuilding because I love that sport. But what I will say is I was in more pain and I found it harder to recover whilst I was on a low-calorie diet compared to eating a surplus or eating enough food.
Yeah. Look, when it comes to nutrition, again, I will just use the examples of the feedback that I have gotten from my clients is finding somebody who can help them navigate the right sources of food and how much and what to eat, just to give them a somewhat of a good structure, like a good guideline. I have seen so much improvement in not just the ability to, move better, but just everyday quality of life has improved. So this is where nutrition is a tool. I'm not an expert in it whatsoever, but I have seen so much benefit my clients and patients have received by getting the right advice from the right person.
Yeah, I've actually got a friend of mine. She's been on the podcast before, Abby. She works with nutrition. So we're talking about maybe coming out with some stuff,
Amazing.
some information on that. So I would say if you don't know where to start though, understanding the different macronutrients. So just basic protein, carbs and fats and calories and making sure you're eating enough of those. Something I will say, which I think Abby and I will talk about a little bit more, is some of the conventional nutrition advice is not so good for people with Ehlers-Danlos, especially if you've got certain things. I'm just going to use myself as an example here. I've got gastroparesis, which means that my digestive system is slightly paralyzed or slow motility. So food digests really slowly. If I eat really high fiber diets, which is very conventional fitness industry advice, my stomach really, the food just sits there. I get very sick. And that actually can cause not only, I feel a bit funny today because I ate high fiber. If I did it for weeks on end, that has caused for me before months of issues that I have to work hard to fix. And one of the things that brought for me was small intestine bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO, which I actually had to go on antibiotics to stop because the food just sat in my gut for a long time and developed bacteria, both of which are known phenomenons with Ehlers-Danlos. Not saying everyone has it, but the digestive system is something that we need to really pay attention to with Ehlers-Danlos. So yeah, understanding food. Then we also can overlap that with performance nutrition, which I think is pretty important. Although people with Ehlers-Danlos, we may not think of ourselves as high-level athletes, what we're doing is really pushing our body to its limits in a lot of in day-to-day activity. So adopting that rather than diet culture. If you're going to follow any nutrition advice, go for high-performance nutrition over diet culture or bodybuilding diets.
At the end of the day, the core message is whatever you're doing, whether it's nutrition or training or rehab, it should have a positive impact in your everyday life, the quality of your life.
Yeah. And I think, I liken a lot of the diet culture stuff to similar to the boot camp stuff. They just tell you more, or less, without giving any kind of reason or logic behind it. Whereas the performance nutrition is a little bit more like what we said before, understand the reason behind things. Performance nutrition understands a lot more of the reasons. So look for someone who deals with performance nutrition if you're wanting to get help with it, and make sure that you explain the stuff with Ehlers-Danlos, gastroparesis, GERD, small intestine bacterial overgrowth, those sorts of things.
Perfect.
Now, the last one that we've got here, and we've talked about this so many times, so I don't think we need to go into depth on this, but rehab isn't linear. And this is something that Shant and I kind of discovered together. I haven't heard many people talk about it still. But do you want to go over it, or do you want me to?
Yeah, so when it comes to rehab, again, the goal of rehab is to make sure that we identify what the problem is, we get rid of the problem, strengthen what we need to strengthen so you can go back to doing what you did before, and probably a little bit more resilient, a little bit more robust. So that should be the goal of rehab. When it comes to people with EDS and hypermobility, you always need to remember the rehab is not going to be a linear process. So what I mean by that, if you have an injury right now and you come up with it, and I have given you a rehab protocol, it will work really well for, say, 2 months, maybe 6 weeks, maybe 3 months. But then you'll notice that the same exercise is starting to cause you a little bit of a pain. It's actually starting to cause you a little bit of a problem. It's not that you have done anything wrong or the rehab protocol is wrong. It just means with that added laxity within the joints, when things starts to go really, really well in one direction, the other direction starts to feel a little bit more left behind. And that is what's creating the problem. So then you need to come back and reassess and have a little bit more updated rehab protocol. It's not that you have done anything wrong. If anything, you have done it right. You have done your job so well that you have gotten yourself to a point where things are really strong now. You just need to make sure that you complement that strength with something else that is lagging behind now.
Yeah, it's sort of like if you're driving along. Oh, the fireworks just went off for those watching the video. If you're driving along and your goal is to go straight, but the car can't quite go straight, you're in a car that is never going to, the steering's a bit off.
Yeah.
So it's steering slightly to the right and you think, oh, I'm going to have to work hard and pull it over to the left. So you pull it over to the left and then it goes a little bit too far to the left and then you have to work hard to pull it over to the right.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of people's bodies can just go in a straight line. And sometimes they might hit a rock and that sends them off to the left and then they need to work hard to go back onto the right. But with our bodies, the steering is just slightly off. So we're always going to have imbalances. Yeah, we've got these underlying imbalances that we're correcting and then we've just got to overcorrect it, back over here. But what we're not doing is we're not, okay, my car's going to the left. Now I'm steering it over to the right. Oh my gosh, I'm panicking. It's going to the right too far. What's going wrong? Oh, I hate my rehab specialist. They didn't give me the right thing. This is all not working. Strength training isn't for me. That's not what we want to do. It's like, oh, okay, I've gone too far to the right now. Okay, I'm just going to calmly go over a little bit more to the left.
Correct. Yeah. And this is something very important to remember. It's a fluid process. It's not going to be linear. I have not come across one that has hypermobility and EDS having a linear progression. It's adapting. Think of it as you're adapting to the progress. So sometimes progress, like you said, it can go a little bit to the right. You need to make sure that you adapt to the left. When it goes a little bit too far to the left, you adapt it back to the right. All you're trying to do is trying to stay within a spectrum of central movement pattern.
Yeah. And one more thing I'll add is that I think that this is a big flaw in a lot of the conventional rehab approaches. Not necessarily a flaw, but it's a blind spot. Let's call it a blind spot in a lot of the conventional rehab approaches, where a lot of rehab specialists are taught to work with these once-off injuries that just happen. Maybe someone was playing sport and they tore their ACL. Okay, we need to get you back on track with that. Yeah. Maybe someone was, I don't know, fell over onto their shoulder and it dislocated. Okay, we need to get you back on track with that. With Ehlers-Danlos and hypermobility, we haven't done anything wrong. We haven't made an error. We haven't had a single moment where something, maybe it was that we, did a certain thing and it pulled a joint in a particular position and dislocated or subluxed it.
Yeah.
But the problem is not that particular exercise that we did that caused that. Or we haven't had this one single incident. The underlying problem is our hypermobility. So that's why we need more ongoing management rather than, okay, we'll get you fixed up and then you're on the road, back 100% on your own. With Ehlers-Danlos and hypermobility, it's constant management because the source of our problem is constantly there. And if we do, for example, hurt ourselves doing a particular exercise, that's not to say that that exercise is necessarily demonized or the wrong one, because the problem is the underlying hypermobility. We just weren't properly prepared for it.
Correct.
Awesome. So just to go over what we've discussed so far, we've talked about progressive overload. We talked about strengthen over stretching and not relying exclusively on manual therapy, both for training progress, but also for rehab staff. We talked about understanding program structure is super important, knowing how to warm up properly, conserving energy is super important. Do more to do more, or sometimes another way of saying that is sometimes we have to regress in order to progress. Understanding anatomy, understanding the purpose of different exercises so that we can be selective about what we're doing, but also so that we can adapt those exercises. And not just exercises, but prescriptions, how many reps or sets or rest. Basic understanding of nutrition and knowing that our rehab is not linear. So this is actually quite a lot of information that we've given. So hopefully this is a good starting point for a lot of you. Like I said, I do have the Bendy and Strong course coming up soon, which is a 14-week course. And I've devised this course with the help of people with Ehlers-Danlos. So I've sat down with about 10 people with EDS and also got information from a further 20 or 30 people, just finding out what they needed help with, also finding out what would fit their budget. So the course has been designed to be affordable for as many people as possible. It's a 14-week course at $25 Australian per week. But I understand that even that can be difficult for people, especially in today's economy. So I've made it a number of free and discounted spots available. This course has been a couple of months in the making. We're going to be covering, obviously nutrition's not included because I'm not a nutritionist, but I think pretty much everything else is going to be covered in this course, and quite a lot more in depth. So that's going to be starting, I don't know, depending on when you're listening to this podcast, it's going to be starting in the last week of April 2024, and it's going to be running for 14 weeks, as I said. So if you're listening to this, register. If you're listening to this in the future, I'll probably be running it again. So stay tuned for that. But if in doubt, just send me a message on my Instagram. So my Instagram is Annie Short Strength, and Shant's Instagram is strength.revolution.
Correct. Yeah.
And we'll talk to you on the next podcast.
And one thing I want to add is about this course. Something that I have found really, really useful is when my clients and patients, they start to learn a little bit more about these specific information, my job becomes a lot easier to prescribe the rehab. So I'm not spending so much time explaining a lot of very basic rudimental things, such as what is a set, what is a rep, what does this exercise mean? I don't even know what glute means. Where is my glute? So this course is something that I have actually recommended for quite a few of my clients, that they're very, very excited to know about this. So I will say having the basic understanding and working knowledge of your body can be a game changer when it comes to picking the right client, picking the right clinician, picking the right coach, picking the right trainer, understanding if that training program is right for you or not. So you are actually empowering yourself with the knowledge so you can look after yourself a little bit better. So one of the things that I mentioned to one of my clients yesterday that has EDS and hypermobility is that sometimes you guys are your best coaches because nobody understands your body better than you can. And a lot of the times it's very hard to find clinicians and coaches that can actually validate you. Like they just think, oh, you have flexibility. Look how flexible you are. What is the problem? Or the trainers would be like, oh, just shut the fuck up and just do this. We don't want that. You can be the best coach for yourself, and you can take a good online program and make it more tailor-made for yourself. So you know exactly what to take out, what to keep in, and how to separate the program a little bit better to suit yourself.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of the other podcast guests I've had on, Mary Pontini. She's got MS and hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos. And I remember her saying, she said, oh, I know more than most trainers, my level of knowledge around my condition. And she still has a coach. So it doesn't mean that you know so much that you can, you don't need a coach or you don't want to coach. Like I said, I still get Shant to train me. He coaches me. But it just means that you know how to adapt the training for you. In the moment when you're doing a set, okay, I know this. I know I'm supposed to feel good pain. What I'm feeling right now is bad pain. So I know to stop.
Yep.
And I know how to communicate that with my coach or my physio.
Correct.
And then the other thing I see is a lot on my social media, people commenting and saying, oh, my physio told me to do this. Is this right? having the knowledge to say, actually, that's not true. And one of my friends who does research on Ehlers-Danlos found, I can't remember the number, but it was this enormous percentage of people with an EDS diagnosis in the population that they sampled. It was a huge percentage of them either had a healthcare background or an immediate family member in healthcare. Because having this knowledge, this health IQ, allows you to communicate and stand up for yourself a lot more and advocate for yourself in the context of getting a diagnosis, in the context of working with a physio or working with a coach. So that's one of the goals of this course as well.
Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for Shant for coming on. If you have an injury that you really need help with, if you've got pain that you just can't get over, he is the person to see. He does online consults.
Yep, but online and in-person consults.
And in-person consults. So I've also got a code that you can use for his sessions to get a discount. This is a special thing that he has set up for my clients and followers with Ehlers-Danlos and hypermobility. So I'll post that in the description, but it's Annie100 if you want to use that. And yeah.
Amazing. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you for being on. All right. See you all in the next episode or in the course.